Excuse me for a second. I do need to take a drink. I'd encourage you to open back up to what Brian read for us a moment ago. There in Mark chapter 2. So I want to use what Jesus says as the basis for what we're going to talk about tonight. So in Mark chapter 2 here, begins a couple interactions that are recorded for us about Jesus essentially arguing about the Sabbath with the Jewish leaders at the time. So in the passage that was read first, Jesus shows the Pharisees that they had misunderstood God's intention for the Sabbath. He's using examples and saying, you guys have this all wrong. They made it about personal ritual righteousness. That to be righteous, you had to keep the Sabbath as a ritual. And if you don't know what the Sabbath is, it was basically the command of God to the ancient Israelites that at the end of the week they were to take a day and rest from their work and to spend time in worship and really in celebration in a lot of ways. And so that's what they're talking about, what's allowed and what's not allowed on the Sabbath. And so Jesus is walking with some of them and his disciples are hungry, and so they take pieces of grain and rub it in their hands and eat it. And to the way that the Jewish leaders were viewing the Sabbath at that time in that day, that was sin. It was the end of the world for them. And so Jesus uses examples to say, you guys have missed the mark on this. So Jesus says at the end, which is really what I want to focus on, verses 27 and 28. Jesus says at the end, the Sabbath was made for man, for people, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So that is what Jesus concludes with for them, and then there's going to be another interaction right after that. But Jesus says the Sabbath was made for people, not people made for the benefit of the Sabbath. And he adds the fact that as the Son of Man, or as the Lord of humankind, then he rules over the Sabbath. It's important to understand that in the background of their discussion, there were some Jewish rabbis who said that human beings were created to keep the Sabbath. So he's literally quoting that type of teaching to them. That they said that humanity was created to keep God's Sabbath that he instituted. And that probably goes back to the fact that the principle of Sabbath is first talked about in Genesis chapter 2, where it says that God rested from all his works, and that is why the seventh day is holy. A paraphrase of what it said there in Genesis. However, Jesus shows them that the Sabbath was actually exemplified, given as an example, and created by God for the benefit of human beings. And so that's what Jesus is saying in saying the Sabbath was made for man, is that the Sabbath was given for the benefit of people and not the other way around. Rest, Sabbath, was given for people. And actually, the law says that too. I don't necessarily know what the Pharisees were focusing on and ignoring, but there are portions in the law that make it very clear, such as in Deuteronomy 5, that the point of the Sabbath was to give rest to others, for them to reflect on God rescuing them from slavery, and that it was part of God's mercy. And so the Sabbath was part of God's mercy under the law to remind them of his rescuing them, providing for them, and then their expectation of eternity with him. And that's what the Sabbath was about, according to the law. But I don't want to just talk about the Sabbath today. And again, that might be a new word for you. We're not talking about a ritual type of Sabbath. Jesus says that the Sabbath was created for the benefit of people. And so really I want to talk more about that sort of benefit, that principle that Jesus is discussing. So instead of talking about the Sabbath specifically, I want to reflect on Jesus' statement about the principle of Sabbath and rest. and to see that this is really a gift from God. And so I hope that what we're going to see is the principle of rest as is in the Sabbath is part of God's gift to us, and it's anchored in our hope for eternity. That's what it's about. It's about rest and looking forward in hope to eternity. And so really, for us, in combination with our American, you might have heard of hustle culture before, where you just got to keep going and do the next thing and, jump job to job, all of that. So in combo with American hustle culture and then the information overload that we get from news and social media and everything else, it's really easy for us to ignore this. The prescription, really, that God gives of rest in Scripture. And in ignoring that, sometimes we find ourselves continuing just to go and to go and to go, and then we're exhausted and we're lost, and we've lost perspective on what's most important because we haven't taken any time out. We haven't taken that time to be holy, to think about things, to connect with God. And so really, utilizing, I'll say, a Sabbath is something that can be really wise and helpful for us. And it provides restoration and reflection, all the things that the original Sabbath was intended to do for the people of Israel. But first we need to make some comments about the Sabbath itself so we don't misunderstand what we're talking about. So believe it or not, the idea of whether we should be keeping the Sabbath today is debated quite a bit. Maybe by people who have too much time on their hands because it's their job to argue about this stuff. But I want to make sure that we don't misunderstand what we're talking about. And we'll make, I believe it's 5 considerations, so 5 points about it. And then I want to use what both the Old Testament and the New Testament say about the nature of the Sabbath to help us understand that principle of faithful rest. So the first thing that I want to talk about and say very clearly is that the Sabbath is not binding for us today. That might be debated, but I think it is very clear from Scripture that the Sabbath is not binding for us today. What that means is we are not required under biblical law to keep the Sabbath as a matter of righteousness. So I don't want that to be misunderstood in what we're talking about. We should not walk away from this thinking that we're obligated to keep the Sabbath, not do anything on Saturday as the Jewish people did under the law. That's not what we're saying. And in fact, the Apostle Paul makes it clear that to insist on the Sabbath, among other things, as a point of righteousness would actually be to undermine the gospel. So I want to look at Colossians chapter 2 real quickly, where Paul discusses this. So Colossians chapter 2, in verses 13 through 17 here, he's talking about the influence that they're undergoing and the things that people are trying to get them to do and to worry about. And he makes this point of you were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, and God made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with all its legal demands, which is commonly understood to be talking about the law of Moses. So this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. And so here's Paul's conclusion as a result of that. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So these people, the Colossians, were being influenced that you need to keep circumcision and you need to keep festivals and you need to keep the Sabbath and all these different kinds of things. And Paul says, no, you don't, because Christ has fulfilled that. He's set it aside. So don't feel that you're obligated to do this. The Sabbath itself is a part of things that are foreshadowing Jesus and actually are found to be fulfilled in Jesus. I don't know how much we talk about that, the fact that the Sabbath is fulfilled in Jesus, and we don't have tons of time to talk about it tonight. But Paul says to insist on someone having to keep the Sabbath or a festival or certain dietary restrictions as a matter of righteousness is to undermine what Jesus has done. So that is very clear from what Paul says. So the New Testament also makes clear that the Sabbath, it was in anticipation of Christ's work. It was a foreshadowing. It was showing what was going to come in the future. And that was that someone was going to come and do what the Sabbath was pointing us to. And when you look at the intention of it, it was in anticipation of Christ's work in rescuing us from spiritual slavery, and then our expectation of eternal rest with God. And that's what he told Israel, that you are to rest on this day so that you can remember when I rescued you from the land of Egypt, and all of your people around you can also have rest. But it's important to remember, too, with that the Sabbath was not just a day of sitting around and staring at each other. I think that's what we usually think, that they were just supposed to sit in their rooms and just look at each other and talk. But that's not what was going on. It was often a day of worship. That would be the synagogue service on Saturdays. And there would be festivals that were allowed. You could have a wedding feast. You could have all kinds of things. So it was not just sitting around and looking at each other, but it was about faithful rest in appreciation and also anticipation of what God was doing. And so that's the first thing. The Sabbath is not binding on us in the sense of ritual righteousness, where we need that to be faithful to God, as the Jews did. And the next is that rest can help us to renew focus on our hope. So that's kind of the principle behind the Sabbath, of why God gave it, to help us renew our focus on what's most important. So that's why he commanded it to the Jews, so that you don't forget what I've done for you, that you understand and appreciate what I've done. So our practice of rest can demonstrate our focus, for one, on a future life instead of this life, and then an expectation of when we will be able to rest from the difficulties that life brings us. I've also seen a really interesting suggestion from some authors, and I have to look into this more, that the practice of engaging in intentional rest demonstrates a resistance to the way of this world. That says, no, I'm not going to buy into all of this, and I'm going to take a time out because I'm thinking about other things. So it's a resistance to the way of the world and its sole focus on work and success in this life, and saying, I have a focus elsewhere. And I think that's helpful. So in addition to that, the idea that it can be helpful for us to renew our focus, we also need to realize, as Paul was talking about, that a personal Sabbath observance or a habit of this kind of rest should not be considered a criterion of righteousness. Because that could be really easy. I do this, and you need to do it, or you're not as good as I am. And that can be a really easy thing. But Paul makes it very clear in his discussion of matters of personal faith and other things, in honoring different days in Romans 14, that we shouldn't do that. You can keep that, but you shall not bind that on someone else as a matter of salvation, is sort of a way to talk about what he's discussing. He makes it clear that none of that should be bound on other people. It's not a matter of righteousness. Again, this is not something that we have to keep ritually, but I do think that it's helpful and wise to make this a habit, to make this a practice. So we need to be careful not to think that this is part of what makes someone righteous, but I do think it's helpful and wise. And then sort of on the flip side of that, we can look at this as a good thing and something that benefits us, and we need to be careful not to look down on other people who maybe don't do it like we do. But rest is also not an excuse to neglect people or responsibilities. So Jesus' discussion of the Sabbath makes that abundantly clear. So the leaders of his day, they had changed the Sabbath into this point of personal righteousness to the neglect of other people. Basically to say, I can't help you with that because I'm taking my Sabbath. And that was how they viewed it. I'm being righteous, so I can't help you with your situation here. And so as an example of this, I want to look at Matthew chapter 12, which is actually kind of Matthew's version of what we read in Mark chapter 2. But after that discussion about the Lord of the Sabbath, the point of the Sabbath there, he went on from there and he entered their synagogue. It's the Sabbath, so there's a synagogue service. And a man was there with a withered hand. And so they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to work. Apparently you're not supposed to rub grain in your hands either. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. And other authors say that Jesus actually sort of presents this question. Is it lawful to do good and to heal on the Sabbath? And he brings this illustration to them. So on the Sabbath, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, is not going to take hold of it and lift it out? Obviously, if you have an animal that's valuable to you and it falls in a hole, even if it's the Sabbath, you're going to grab it and pull it out. If someone in your family is suffering, you're going to help them. And that's his example. So of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. They were denying that, essentially. Nobody would come out and say that, but they were saying, my rest time with God, my personal Sabbath, means that I am not available to help you with your problems, that I can't take care of my responsibilities. And Jesus points out that that is completely backward. If, again, we understand the purpose of why God is presenting rest and Sabbath to us, it's for the very reason of doing things like that. And so he demonstrated that with the true intentions of the Sabbath, it's not an excuse to ignore helping people. And it's not an excuse to not do good for others. So an example that I thought of is if we are making this habit of a personal day of rest, and someone needs to move, don't say, sorry, I can't help you move because I'm taking my Sabbath day. Or if someone in your family needs help, I mean, those are examples of that. And there is obviously a balance here, right? Where we need to prioritize our taking time to be holy, but we also need to be careful not to approach this from a position of selfishness, because that is really easy too. To look at this from a selfish point of view and say, this is my time and what I need to do, because the goal of what we're talking about is ultimately faithfulness toward God and His gifts. That's the point of the rest and the refocusing and all those things, is that so we can be more faithful with what God has given us and to God Himself. And so it's not an excuse to ignore people and to not do things that we need to do. And the last thing that I want to talk about is more of just sort of a between the lines. There's no specification in the New Testament of any kind of specific days or durations or activities that qualify as rest in this way. Really, the New Testament authors don't talk about Sabbath very much, except to say, don't bind it on anyone as a matter of righteousness, and also Jesus fulfills the Sabbath. And that's kind of the discussion about it. So the Sabbath was not bound on first century Christians. There was also nothing else directly offered in its place. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but if you look at the New Testament and you also look at first century history, it wasn't as if, Sunday is automatically replacing the Sabbath. That's not what happened. For Jewish Christians, often it was Sunday was in addition to the Sabbath, and that's a really interesting study. So there's no specified time. There's no specified duration of it. It's got to be a day. It has to be certain hours. It's got to be, a weekend or whatever it is. But there's this idea of rest and reflection. You can see it in Jesus' life. You can see it in the examples that we have in various places there. So maybe it's your regular times in your morning routine, that you have that time where you are resting and dedicating yourself to God. Maybe it's a certain day of the week. I think that maybe is the most natural way to look at the principle of rest, as in the way that God initially enacted it, is take a day. It might be, a certain weekend in the month, because the reality is that some of us don't have jobs that allow us maybe to have a whole day to ourselves every week. I think of some of our brothers and sisters who are working 13 days in a row, and they literally don't have a day where they can do that. This is a gift, a privilege, when we have the ability to do it. And so we can't be too restrictive on saying what qualifies as it for someone and what doesn't. And also, for a lot of you, Sunday might be a good and natural time for this, a day of reflection and rest and worship. And I want to say, if that works for you, congratulations, because I cannot do that at all. Salem, in some ways, does not like Sundays. It's pretty exhausting. So if Sunday works for you, great, but that doesn't work for everybody. Because I have heard that before of, Sunday is our Sabbath now, and we have to do that. Well, what's that say? What about me? It's kind of a way that I think about it. And this neglects the fact that if you look at the first century, Christians worked on Sundays. They didn't have that day off like we do in our modern weekends. They worked on Sundays, and that's why when you look at Acts, they're meeting for worship in the evening after work's done, into the wee hours of the morning, because that's what they had to do. And so we need to understand that there's not this clear-cut transfer here of, Sabbath is now Sunday, or specific days, or specific times, or activities. So actions aren't specified. But if you look at what was allowed and what was not allowed in the law concerning the Sabbath, you can see that what was banned by God of don't do these things was primarily an emphasis on work where you're trying to provide for yourself or achieve things. So don't kindle a fire, don't tread your grain and all kinds of things such as that. Don't gather manna. Don't try to provide for yourself, because you need to think about how God has provided for you, is a way to quickly paraphrase that. And so because of that, because there's not a clear-cut don't do this and don't do that, rest might look different for different people nowadays. So I know for certain people, they find restorative rest on working on something with their hands, depending on what it is. And it depends on the project for me. Sometimes it aggravates me to no end, and sometimes it's relaxing. Maybe it's sitting around with your family and playing board games or watching movies together and actually spending time together. Maybe it's taking a walk. Maybe it's doing a hobby of yours. And obviously all of this is to be combined with reflection and with worship toward God. So whatever that is, nevertheless, the principle of regular rest and comfort and hope in God is clear. That is a thing that we see throughout Scripture. But there's not a prescription on it has to look like this for you, is really what we're talking about with that consideration. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Sabbath, and I know that that is not the most exciting thing to listen to, and I apologize for that. But I want to make sure that we're not misunderstanding what we're talking about. Because we're talking about rest. And we're talking about the concept of rest as God has given it to us as a gift. And sort of the guidelines of what constitutes as real rest and what doesn't. And so that's what we're looking at in those considerations, to understand what does faithful rest look like. And so now I want to make just a couple brief comments about implementing all of this that I think might be helpful. So these are more practical things as to what might get in the way or what can help us to more readily achieve this rest. And so the first one that I want to say is that we need to put down our phones. We've got to put down our phones. That is not rest. That is not faithful, restorative, Sabbath principle sort of rest in the way that God is talking about it. It is literally still being plugged into the world. And there's all of this research more and more coming out that is just making it abundantly clear how overusing our phones is terrible for us. And for some of us, that is kind of what we go to immediately as a rest. I've got a free moment, so I'm going to pick up my phone and check on things, or it's quiet around the house, so I'm going to sit in my bed on my phone. And I want you to think about the fact and really realize that that is not good for you, for one thing, from a practical standpoint. And I do not think that that constitutes rest as we're talking about it. So we need to put down our phones, just even for your health. If you don't believe what I'm saying in terms of relating this to rest, just for your own health, please put down your phones. And I'm saying this from personal experience. I'm not saying this in I've never had an issue with this, and you guys need to all do what I say. But from personal experience, I think you will find a lot of benefit from just taking a Sabbath from your phones. And before some of us think, well, yeah, I don't have a smartphone, I don't do those kind of things, the same thing can be said about rotting in front of the TV all day. So these generations have their phones, but if you go to my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, they're sitting around rotting in front of the TV all day. And it's sort of the same thing. And so we need to understand that if we know what it does to us, for one, it's not rest, and also it doesn't qualify as what God is talking about. And so the next thing I'm about to say is probably not going to mean anything to half of you, so just bear with me as I explain it. But uncontrolled bed rotting does not count as rest either. So the term bed rotting is something that we young people talk about, where it is literally the idea of laying in your bed for hours on end, eating, watching TV, sitting on your phone, and it's sort of this self-care phenomena that is going on right now. I've actually read some articles, just, is this any good for us, sort of a thing? But bed rotting without any guardrails or boundaries does not qualify as what we're talking about. And in fact, if done habitually or done without any boundaries, it's pretty clear that it can just be terrible for your mental and physical health. So that's one thing. So you're getting some health tips from me today, however valuable that is. But also that this does not qualify as spiritual centered rest as God is talking about. So really with all of those, making sure not to be distracted by our phones, not going with these fads that really aren't that good for us, we need to look for intentional, restorative ways to enjoy what God has given us and to recenter ourselves around His promises. So that, again, it might be spending time with our family, doing activities that we enjoy. That might be taking a break and taking a walk. There are different things, but the idea is to enjoy the gifts that God has given us in His grace and to refocus our lives around His promises and what we can expect in the future. Because Hebrews makes it abundantly clear that Jesus fulfills the Sabbath in the way that we can expect to enter God's rest once and for all when we're with Him. And He says that is what the Sabbath was prefiguring. And so resting really is to say, one day I will be with God, free from all of this labor and toil, resting in His promises. And so when we think about it way back, all the way in the beginning, God gave an example of resting from labor. As we say when we were kids, God doesn't need to take a nap. He did that for us as an example. He commanded His people to keep the Sabbath and to rest so that they could remember what He had done for them and what was promised for them later. And then we have the full fulfillment of the Sabbath in Jesus, who rescues us from spiritual slavery and the demoralizing struggles that we have in this world as a result of our work and the difficulties with that, and who gives us the promise of resting with Him for eternity. And that's really what rest and what the principle of Sabbath are about. So we can understand rest as a gift from God, and it is something that we can use to put His wisdom into our lives, to help us live more fulfilling lives that are glorifying to Him. But in our world today, we either ignore the concept of hopeful rest, such as ancient Israel had in the Sabbath, or we go to the other extreme and we abuse rest in order to avoid the reality of struggle in this life. So we have the Pharisees on one hand who take the Sabbath and make it all about themselves in terms of proving how righteous they were and neglecting what God pointed out. And on the other hand, we have the way that we typically view rest today, where it is our own selfish way to tune out from everything and distract ourselves from how terrible the world is. God provides a better way. Through hoping in his deliverance, that we can experience a little bit now, which is part of what Hebrews talks about. We can experience a little bit of this rest now with the confidence that we will be free from the difficulties in this world one day. And that's what rest is about, getting a little bit of taste of that and putting our minds back into that focus, that this is what this is about. So faithful and intentional rest from the example of the Sabbath can benefit us and is part of resting and hoping in God. So really find some practical ways to do that, to find intentional, restorative rest in your life. Again, that might be a day for you. It might be regular time in the mornings. Whatever it is, find time to recenter yourself on God and his promises. And if this is all new to you, and you don't know what we're talking about with the Sabbath and why we're talking about these kinds of things, I want you to consider something that Jesus said. And this is actually what Matthew presents as him saying before this discussion on the Sabbath. Because this is the invitation that Jesus is offering to all of us. So Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." If you want to be able to find true, real rest, to throw off the difficulties that this life gives you and a hope to look forward to, then this is what Jesus is offering. And we want to do whatever we can to help you take advantage of that. So talk to us after the service, text us during the week, or you can come talk to me up here while we stand and sing.